The Landing of the Pilgrims, Part 2, Between Two Worlds, 1620 to 1621. How Master Christopher Jones brought the Mayflower across the vast and furious ocean through many and diverse perils, and came upon Cape Cod, September to November, 1620. Up came the dripping anchor as the sailors spun the capstan to the rhythm of a rousing chanty. The Mayflower slowly swung about, and her sails filled with the light breeze. There was a waving of hats and scarves. The rugged shoreline faded into a blue smudge on the horizon. The ship dipped and rose as her brown sails tugged and billowed in the spanking breeze. Hungry-eyed, the Mayflower's passengers lingered at the rail, feeding on the last sight of old England. One by one, with tear-wet cheeks, they turned away to the immediate crowded life and routine of shipboard. Exploring youngsters were hauled out of the rigging and warned away from the ship's rails by scolding mothers. Sleeping quarters were assigned below decks and in the after cabins, and the routine of feeding 100 passengers 3 times a day began. Seasick landlubbers gradually got their sea legs to navigate the rhythmic rise and fall of the ship's decks. Each morning and evening, the Pilgrims knelt together and fervently prayed, thanking God for his goodness and blessing. Devoutly, they listened to the Bible reading of the Lord's providence for his people on perilous seas, of Israel's crossing of the Red Sea, of Noah, of Jonah, and of Paul, and of how these passed safely through troubled waters. Each day they watched the ever-changing sky and the mysterious sea, always from the exact center of the great circle where the two met on the horizon. Alongside, the porpoises played in gay parades, and sometimes the glistening backs and misty spoutings of a school of sperm whales could be seen. The foam broke in white plumes from the bluff bows of the Mayflower as she dipped her blunt nose into the mid-Atlantic swells, ever pushing into the west. In her wake, a lacy green foam track stretched back toward England. From her mainmast, the jaunty British merchant flag, with its crosses of St. Andrew and St. George and St. Andrew, flashed in the sunlight. Then the weather changed and worsened. The skies lowered and the wind rose into the wild autumn gales of the North Atlantic, blowing out of the west. The ship lifted like a cork, riding the heavy seas, and plunged down vast mountainsides of water. She staggered under the blows of waves that washed over her decks. Beneath her keel, and pushing back against her bows, flowed the current of the then unknown Gulf Stream, moving eastward through the ocean. The Leiden congregation was made up of devout Christians. If they prayed and often spoke the name of God, it was with deep reverence and gratitude. But the crew of the Mayflower were tough British sailors, hardened by the brutal seafaring life of the time. They delighted in cursing the pious, blaspheming the name of God, and shouting foul language in the presence of the passengers, till the women held their hands to their ears and the Pilgrim elders shuddered. The best and the worst companioned on the heaving decks of the little ship on a long, strange voyage. A proud and very profane young seaman, the bitterest against the Pilgrims of all the wild crew, had mockingly said he hoped to help cast half of them overboard before they reached land. Soon after, he was smitten with a grievous malady and shortly died. As they solemnly consigned his body to the sea, both passengers and crew stood awed, believing that this was none other than the just hand of God upon his wickedness. As the weather worsened, Master Jones ordered that in heavy seas all the passengers must remain below decks. In spite of orders, young John Howland returned out on the main deck in the midst of a violent gale. A great wave struck the ship and pitched him into the raging sea. "Man overboard!" The shout was lost in the roar of the storm as the yellow head of John Howland disappeared in the furious waters. And then the incredible happened. As Howland went down, his hand grasped the end of a rope that trailed over the ship's side. When the ship rose on the next wave, Howland, clinging desperately, was swung against the ship's side. In a moment, a boat hook had been thrust through his leather jacket, and he was hauled over the rail to safety. It was the hand of God that reached out and saved him, said every pilgrim on the Mayflower. Day after day, the staunch little ship held on, a speck in the violence of wind and water. "The main beam has buckled, sir," shouted the first mate to the skipper standing at the half-deck rail. Below decks they found where the cracked beam sagged under the weight of the main deck. A hurried council debated what to do. Another terrible blow from the seas might break the back of the ship. "Better turn back," said the faint-hearted, "before she breaks up and goes to the bottom." The passengers hauled out a great iron jack screw which they had brought from Leyden, found a firm footing, and slowly turned the screw until it bit into the oaken beam and slowly lifted it back to its proper place. A strong post set firm in the lower deck was put under it, and the huge beam was as stout as ever. Master Jones knew that his ship was strong and firm below the waterline. The upper works could be caulked well enough to keep out any dangerous amount of water. Quote, "So they committed themselves to the will of God and resolved to proceed." Close quote. In the lull of the wind, a shrill, small crying could be heard from the women's cabin. A pilgrim baby had been born in the fury of the storm. "We'll call him Oceanus," said the father, Stephen Hopkins. "He's a drop of the ocean, a sea pearl, a water baby, the youngest pilgrim." Everyone thought it was a wonderful name. Samuel Fuller, their surgeon from Leyden, had brought with him as a servant a lad named William Button. As the journey drew toward its end, the boy sickened, and in spite of his master's profession, died. He was the only one of the passengers to do so on the crossing. Land could not be far off. Master Jones had followed the 42nd parallel scrupulously. It was not possible to miss a whole continent. They must soon sight land after 9 weeks at sea, he figured. Among the passengers there was a sense of excitement and anticipation. This was not an ordinary landing after a long voyage. There was a deep and strong feeling among them of something immense and heroic and biblical beyond the personal happenings of their individual lives. They did not know what the ordeal might be ahead, only that they would never turn back. Something was being left behind forever. Something new and bright and glorious was beginning. They were ready to face untold hardship. They were confident of a wide, new freedom. Vague, deep thoughts that could find no words drew them together in purpose and high resolve. Christopher Jones was a shipmaster who ruled his crew with an iron hand, but he knew a man when he saw one, and he had learned to respect his strange passengers and their faith. A master craftsman of the sea, he had hunted whales in the Baltic, and had for years taken his ship across the Bay of Biscay laden with fragrant casks of Spanish wine. This was his first trip across the Atlantic, but with his compass and cross-staff he could take his ship to any known destination across the 7 seas. He had brought his ship safely across the vast North Atlantic, and he was relieved to think that he would soon disembark his 100 English passengers on the American continent, and, he hoped, soon be on his way home to merry England. Landfall, November 1620. The sun rose red over the rim of the eastern horizon and tinted the sails of the Mayflower a delicate gold. Captain Jones sniffed the westward breeze, smelling the sweet fragrance of the land. Overside, the blue-black of deep water had turned to emerald green. After 9 weeks of the wild Atlantic, land was overdue. The leadsman had found bottom at 80 fathoms, and now, from the lookout at the maintop, came the cry, "Land ho! Land ho!" The Mayflower had made a 67-day crossing, covering about 3,000 miles at an average speed of 2 miles an hour. At once the whole ship came alive and into action. The passengers piled out of their bunks, hastily pulled on their clothing, rushed on deck, and crowded to the rail. Yes, there it was, a dark streak with flecks of white cliff running north and south as far as the eye could reach. As at the long-awaited sight of land, the women's faces became wet with tears, and the men stood silent with hearts too full for words. Kneeling on the deck for morning prayer, they thanked God and sang Old Hundredth with a fervor they had never known before. Their eyes had seen the promised land. In the ship's cabin, Captain Jones explained that the land was not Virginia, but Cape Cod, many leagues to the north, a long bent finger that ran out into the Atlantic and beckoned toward Europe, calling to the old world from the new. But, said the elders, their patent said Virginia. They had contracted with the company to take them to Virginia, and they insisted that the captain carry out the company's part of the bargain. And so the Mayflower tacked about and ran due south. All day the passengers at the rail gazed curiously at the low-lying coast of Cape Cod. As twilight came on, the wind died down. The ship had suddenly come in among shoals and breakers. They were in the perilous waters of a ship's graveyard, the broken part of Pollock's Rip, one of the most dangerous stretches of water on the New England coast. At any moment, the treacherous currents might carry the ship upon the deadly shoals. Pray as you never prayed before, said Captain Jones to the Pilgrim elders. Mercifully, the wind sprang up from the south and filled the Mayflower's sails, slowly pulling her out of the shoals into deep water. She was safe. As darkness fell, the captain hove her to for the night. In the morning, the Pilgrims held a council in the cabin with the captain. It seemed best to take advantage of the good south wind that had saved them and run north to anchor in Cape Cod Bay. Next day, with a fair wind continuing from the south, the Mayflower ran up the coast. By nightfall, they were off Race Point, the northernmost point of Cape Cod. Tomorrow, by God's grace, the ship would find anchorage. There had been some glib talk that day among the strangers who came aboard at London and were not of the congregation. These people had said that when the ship landed at Cape Cod, they would not be bound by the Virginia patent, and so would take orders from none, but would be their own masters. This, thought Elder Brewster that night, is none other than the voice of Satan seeking to sow discord, trouble, and mutiny among the Lord's people. He cast about in his mind for the wording of a compact. If the Mayflower passengers were not under the laws of Virginia, then they would make their own law and agree to abide strictly by it. Next morning, the ship nosed into Provincetown Harbor, around the Long Point. After morning prayer, the passengers assembled between decks to hear their pastor's message. They stood silent and hushed in a solemn pause between two worlds, the old world behind them and the new world on which they had not set foot. Mr. Brewster stood up and said, quote, "It was thought good there should be an association or agreement that we should combine together in one body, and to submit to such government and governors as we should by common consent agree to make and choose, and set our hands to this that follows, word for word." Close quote. Mayflower Compact. In ye name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by ye grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland King, defender of ye faith, etc., having undertaken for ye glory of God and advancement of ye Christian faith, and honor of our King and country, a voyage to plant ye first colony in ye northern parts of Virginia. Do by these presents solemnly and mutually in ye presence of God and one of another, covenant, and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of ye ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for ye general good of ye colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness whereof we have hereunder subscribed our names at Cape Cod, ye 11th of November, in ye year of ye reign of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France, and Ireland, ye 18th, and of Scotland ye 54th, Anno Domini 1620. How the Mayflower came to anchor at Cape Cod, and of how the Pilgrims essayed a voyage of discovery and found goodly stores of Indian corn. November 1620. The Mayflower had put her anchor down in Provincetown Harbor during mid-morning on a Saturday in November 1620. White gulls screamed about the ship, and vast flocks of birds took wing along the shores. Inland, the low hills were covered with goodly trees, and the white beach stretched as far as the eye could see. Because of shallow water, the ship could not come near shore by 3/4 of an English mile. "It is a harbor wherein 1,000 sail of ships may ride," wrote Mr. Winslow with delight. Already that morning, the 41 had put their names to the compact. Every passenger was ready for action after 9 weeks of idleness at sea. At noon, 16 men went ashore in the longboat for wood and water and to explore what the land was. They had to wade the distance of a bow shot or two in the shallow water before they could beach the boat. Ashore, they found springs of sweet water and filled their kegs. From the woods, men brought back a boatload of fragrant juniper for the cook's fire. The shallop brought from England would have been useful in traveling between ship and shore, but when she was examined, she was found badly in need of repairs, a job for the ship's carpenter. Monday morning, she was brought ashore, and work on her started at once, but it was 16 days before she could be made seaworthy. In spite of this difficulty, the passengers were eager to feel the good earth underfoot again. On Monday morning, the women loaded the longboat with soiled linen and went ashore to do their washing in fresh water. "Be sure the Indians don't carry you off," said a sailor laughingly as he helped a plump matron down the ship's ladder. "Though I'm thinking you would be making a toothsome dish for a cannibal chief," he added with a guffaw. Captain Jones, who was leaning on the half-deck rail, found it hard not to smile at this, so he looked away. Lifting his eyes seaward, he saw a thin spout of vapor rising in the air. "Thar she blows," he called as the black backs of a school of whales rose about the ship. "Thar floats a good 4,000 pounds worth of sperm oil, if only we had the harpoons and tackle to take it," replied the mate wistfully. The passengers crowded to the rail, marveling at the strange sea monsters, as one whale, longer than the ship itself, came along almost alongside. A young man hastily loaded a musket and aimed at the whale. There was a sudden explosion. The bursting gun barrel flew into splinters, knocking the man flat on the deck. The whale, with a sweep of his mighty tail, dove for the bottom of Cape Cod Bay. When they picked up the dazed whale hunter, it was found that, miraculously, neither he nor anyone else had been injured by the explosion of the overcharged musket. But there were more important things than shooting whales to be done. In order that no time be lost, on November 25th, a party of 16 goodly men volunteered, under Captain Miles Standish, to explore the coast for a place of settlement. Each man was given a sword, a musket, and a steel corselet to protect his ribs against Indian arrows. The captain put on the steel helmet with nose and cheek guards that he had worn in the wars in Flanders. In single file, the company marched down the endless strip of beach toward the unknown. Under his visor, the blue eyes of the captain ranged the distance, alert and ready for danger, adventure, and the unexpected in the mysterious land that lay before them. Far ahead, he saw a little group of figures advancing toward them on the beach. At first he thought they must be Master Jones and his men who had gone ashore for wood, but as they came nearer, there was no mistaking them. The figures were 5 naked Indians and a dog. The strangers now saw them and stood still. As the captain waved and shouted, the Indians turned and ran at top speed back down the beach. The Englishmen followed on the run, but because of their heavy guns and armor, they were soon outdistanced by the racing Indians. For 10 miles, the Englishmen followed their footprints until they turned off into the woods. At last, darkness overtook them, so they built a barricade of logs and brush and ate their biscuits and cheese by a roaring fire. It was their first night in the wilderness, so the captain posted 3 sentinels, and the rest of the men lay down by their muskets. Soon the weary men were all asleep. In the dawn, they kneeled and prayed, breakfasted, and marched on into the woods. For hours, the discoverers struggled on through the thick brush that tore at their clothes and armor, but they found no trace of Indians. Exhausted and thirsty, they followed deer paths down a steep valley. There they threw themselves down by a cool spring of fresh water and drank our first New England water with as much delight as ever we drank drink in all our lives. Farther on, they came upon a clear pond of fresh water, Pond Village in Truro, where the deer came to drink, and along the banks were flocks of fowl. In an open field, they found new stubble where the Indians had grown corn. Nearby were some old boards where an Indian lodge had been, and by it an iron ship's kettle. Each find hinted of a strange story about the mysterious people of the forest. Nearby was a newly made mound of sand marked with the print of hands. Under it they found a little old basket of gleaming Indian corn. Perhaps even now they thought the unseen people were watching them from the forests. Sentinels stood watch as the discoverers began to dig about the Indian mounds. They uncovered a large new basket, beautifully woven, and took out 36 ears of red and golden corn. The basket held 3 or 4 bushels of corn. This was a treasure more precious than gold to men who would have to get their food from this very soil. The men filled the iron kettle and their pockets with corn and buried the rest till they would come again. Marching on, they came to a river, Plymouth Harbor, where they found 2 Indian canoes, cleverly made of bark. As it was time to return, they followed their trail back to the fresh water ponds and made their barricaded camp. They slept from weariness in the cold rain, where 3 sentinels kept watch through the night. The next morning, after fighting their way through the entangling underbrush, they became aware that they were lost in the forest. In the woods ahead, Stephen Hopkins was calling. When the party came up, he pointed to a bent sapling with a cord and noose cunningly made and set in a deer path, about a bait of acorns. "It is how the Indians catch deer," said Stephen. As William Bradford stepped forward to examine it, the sapling gave a jerk, and he found himself suddenly hanging by one leg upside down. The woods rang with laughter as he was released from the trap and set upon his feet. They soon came out on the beach, where they sighted the Mayflower. They fired off their muskets and were welcomed home by Masters Jones and Carver, who were waiting on shore with the longboat. Quote, "And thus we came, both weary and welcome, home, and delivered our corn into the store, to be kept for seed, for we knew not how to come by any, and therefore were very glad, purposing soon as we could meet with any of the inhabitants of that place, to make them large satisfaction." This was our first discovery. Of the adventure in the shallop, and of the mystery of the blonde skull. It was late November, and the bleak northern winter was upon them. Landward lay the unknown wilderness, where they must soon find a place for their settlement. The shallop was now seaworthy, and ready to take the expedition down the Cape. Master Jones was made the leader of a party that would search for a good site. It consisted of 10 sailors and 24 men from among the passengers. As the shallop ran down the coast through a wild sea, it blew bitter cold with snow. The spray froze to the men's clothing till they were covered with ice. A landing party went ashore at the place of the first discovery, which they called appropriately Cold Harbor, the Plymouth River. All day they marched up and down through the rugged snow-covered hills. That night the hungry marchers feasted under the pines on 3 fat geese and 6 ducks they had killed. They slept in the snow by a fragrant juniper fire under a windward barricade. The next morning they crossed the river in an abandoned Indian canoe and found the place where they had dug up the baskets of corn, Hopkins Cliff. Again they dug, breaking through the frozen ground with their cutlasses and levers until they found 10 more baskets of precious seed corn. Quote, "And sure it was God's providence that we found this corn, for else we know not how we should have done." Close quote. More bad weather was coming, and Master Jones grew anxious for his ship, so he went back with the sick members of the party and the baskets of corn. Before he left, he promised to return the next day with spades and mattocks. The 18 men who remained pushed on through the woods, finding a broad path that they thought might lead to an Indian village. The musketeers lighted their match cords to be ready for action, but the road proved to be only a deer path, leading nowhere. As they came out of the woods into open, level ground, the men found old boards heaped on a log mound that looked like a grave. Digging down, they unearthed rush mats, bowls, trays, and dishes, a bow, and a painted and carved stick, then a new mat, and under that 2 bundles. In the larger bundle, wrapped in a sailor's blouse and breeches, were the bones and skull of a man. The skull had strands of fine yellow hair still on it, and some of the flesh unconsumed. The discoverers looked at one another in wonder. What was the mystery behind this blonde skull at the bottom of a lonely Indian grave on desolate Cape Cod? Had this white man been a great chief, or was he a shipwrecked sailor who had been murdered? What strange tales about the wilderness, as it was before the Mayflower came, could these bones tell? In the other bundle were the bones of a child, with wampum necklaces and bracelets. The men took some of the trinkets that covered the graves. Then they made another discovery: 2 round lodges, scarcely visible under the blanket of snow. Inside the lodges were all the objects of an Indian household, including finely woven mats and earthen pots that had recently been in use. The discoverers took away what they fancied, and as it was growing dark, they hurried down to the shore, went aboard the shallop, and reached the Mayflower that night. As the men told of their adventures and of the mystery of the blonde skull, Elder Brewster's Christian conscience twitched uneasily. They had robbed the Indian graves and stolen the natives' corn. But he promised himself that, quote, as soon as we can meet with them, we will give them full satisfaction. Thus much for our second discovery. Close quote. The third discovery, and the first encounter, and diverse perils by land and sea. November had passed. Winter lay over the Cape, and the weather worsened. Each day there were fewer provisions. The sailors aboard the Mayflower were impatient to start on the return voyage to England. The Pilgrims were anxious to find a safe harbor and a good place to build a settlement. Robert Coppin, the ship's pilot, said he could take them to a good harbor across the bay where he had been on a previous voyage. The place was called Thieves' Harbor because an Indian had there stolen a harpoon from them. For a second time, the shallop put off from the Mayflower and ran down the Cape coast before a stiff east wind that blew ever colder. The sea spray froze in the men's beards. Miles Standish and his musketeers wrapped their heavy cloaks around their muskets to keep them dry. Brewster and Carver huddled in the stern, and the pilot, Coppin, manned the tiller. In all, there were 16 men. 2 seasick men hung limply over the gunwales. After a 20-mile run, they came to a sandy point of land running out into the bay, Billingsgate Point, and found a fair harbor, Wellfleet Bay. As the sailors sought to make a landing among the sand flats, they spied away down the beach a little group of figures crowded around some dark object. When the seamen hailed them, they quickly disappeared into the woods. Wading over the sand flats, the discoverers came ashore and built a landward barricade and a fire. 5 miles inland, they saw a smoke column rise in the evening sky from an Indian signal fire. The Indians had seen them and were warning their people. By this time, the discoverers were too tired to worry about them, so after a lean supper, they slept on the frozen ground. In the morning, the party divided, some going in the shallop to explore the coast, and the rest marching inland to seek a suitable place of settlement. In the sea wash along the beach, they came upon the 15-foot body of a strange sea creature. "It is a kind of whale called a grampus," said Coppin, cutting a strip of flesh with his knife from the carcass. It was 2 inches thick of solid fat. Farther down the beach, they found another grampus, half stripped of his coat of fat. The sand about the creature's body was printed with the feet of the Indians the men had seen from the boat. "We will call this place Grampus Bay," said Captain Standish. All day the men ranged over the rough country, seeking a site for their new world home, but they found none. Their exploring was not useless, however, for it taught them one thing. Old cornfields, abandoned lodges, and a melancholy Indian cemetery, surrounded by a high palisade, were evidence enough that the mysterious Indians were near. As the red sun sank in the gray west, the discoverers marched wearily back to the seacoast. Thank heaven they could see the brown sail of the shallop standing offshore. As they made camp, there was a cheerful feeling in finding one another safe again. After warming their numb hands at the juniper fire behind the rough barricade, they ate their bit of cheese and biscuit. Soon they were asleep with their muskets under their cloaks. It seemed they had hardly closed their eyes when a voice roused them. Wake up, Captain. The Indians be upon us. The sentinel was shaking Standish violently by the shoulder. To arms, to arms. The cry brought every man to his feet in a moment. From the woods came a high-pitched yell in a wild, inhuman cadence. The sentinels fired a couple of shots toward the sound, and the crying suddenly ceased. It's only the song of the wild wolves, muttered a seaman, who had met wolves before in Newfoundland. The fire was built up, a sentinel added to the watch, and they slept on uneasily through the night. Before dawn, the men turned out and knelt in a circle while Brewster said the morning prayers. The cook prepared breakfast. Several men took their muskets down to the shore, where they left them till the shallop would come in on the tide. Suddenly, a chorus of wild yells burst from the land side. They were the same yelping cries they had heard at midnight, but this time there was no mistaking the terrible Indian war cry. A shower of arrows fell around the campfire. The 4 men at the barricade who had kept their muskets lighted their fuses at the fire, while the rest ran for the shore where they had left their firearms. Several shadowy figures broke from the woods in pursuit, and then turned and ran as a half-dozen soldiers armed with cutlasses charged out from behind the barricade. Captain Standish called to the shallop, and the heartening cry came back, "Well, well, be of good courage," as the sailors fired 2 or 3 shots. Then someone called from the shallop for a firebrand to light their match cords. A soldier picked a brand from the fire and ran down to the shallop. Arrows showered on the barricade, and the war cries rose louder. In the dim light, the men firing from the barricade could see a huge Indian behind the nearest tree. As the bullets whizzed about him, he kept coolly shooting his bow till a shot hit the tree and sent splinters flying about his head. He gave a terrific yell and ran as the whole band vanished into the forest. The Englishmen followed them for a quarter of a mile, keeping up the firing. The fight was over. The men came back and gathered up the arrows to send to England as a grim souvenir of how things were in New England. Quote, "Yet by the special providence of God, none of them either hit or hurt us, though many came close by us and on every side of us, and some coats were hung up in our barricado, and some coats which hung up in our barricado were shot through and through. So after we had given God thanks for our deliverance, we took our shallop and went on our journey and called this place the First Encounter." Close quote. The location was the present Eastham. How the discoverers sought Thievish Bay and found Plymouth Harbor and a goodly situation. December 1620. The first encounter was not the greatest battle of history, but for the hatters and weavers of Leyden, it was a fiery baptism in peril and danger. As they sat in the shallop running before the wind, they recounted to one another all the excitements of their great adventure. By mid-afternoon, the shallop was bucking the rough sea like a wild horse, and the wind bellying her sail in a full arc. It began to rain. Then the rain changed to snow. A great wave tore off the shallop's rudder, leaving the tiller useless in Pilot Coppen's hands. 2 seamen grabbed up oars and held the little boat desperately on her course. The wind rose until the straining mast cracked and broke in 3 places. For a few desperate moments it seemed that the shallop would capsize, but the seamen cut loose the tangle of sail and tackle, and she slowly righted herself. "Good cheer, my hearties," shouted Coppen. "I can see the harbor, and we shall soon be in." As the shallop came in to shore, on the tide and wind, they could see the breakers dashing against the rocky cove. Coppen peered through the dusk. He realized he was mistaken and confused. "So help me, I've never seen this place before," he muttered. "Run her ashore before the wind," he called to the mate. The shallop was rapidly drifting toward where the booming surf broke on the rocks, but the sailors at the steering oars brought her about, and someone shouted, "If you are men, row lustily, or we are lost." The men bent to the oars, and the shallop slowly pulled up into the wind and out of the churning surf toward the open water. Rowing on through the dark and rain in the teeth of a northeaster, presently they pulled in under a dark mass of rock that sheltered them from the bitter winds. Here they anchored for the night. At midnight, the wind changed, and it turned much colder. The men in the shallop shivered through the long night. In the gray of dawn, 3 or 4 men went ashore with the cold in their bones to build a fire. With much coaxing, the damp wood at last took fire, and soon the storm-tossed discoverers were warming their hands around a driftwood fire. After prayers of thanks for deliverance and breakfast, they explored the wooded island all day and found they were safe from the Indians. The next morning, the sun rose brilliantly out of the bay in a clear sky. The men dried the sea water out of their shirts, put their guns in order, and rested from the wildness of the sea. It being Sunday, December 20th, the Pilgrims kept the Sabbath in prayer and in listening to Mr. Brewster's discourse, but the sea-weary sailors snored godlessly around the fire. Quote, on Monday, they sounded the harbor and found it fit for shipping, and marched into the land and found diverse cornfields and little running brooks, a place, as they supposed, fit for situation. At least it was ye best they could find, and ye season and their present necessity made them glad to accept of it. So they returned to their ship again with this news to ye rest of their people, which did much comfort their hearts. Close quote. The third discovery had brought back encouraging news of the good harbor at Plymouth, but tragic news awaited Bradford on the Mayflower. In his absence, his beloved wife, Dorothy, had been drowned. She had fallen overboard in the storm on the day after he had left. He remembered how she had waved him a brave farewell. He had never guessed what fears had filled her heart as she gazed at the bleak coast to which they had so perilously come. They had hoped and planned for a new life together in the wilderness, but now he must go on alone. In time, William turned from his dark thoughts and threw himself into the days of toil and danger that lay ahead. New life as well as death had come aboard the Mayflower. A fine baby boy had been born to Mistress Susanna White. He was the first English baby boy born in New England. They gave him the name of Peregrine, or the Wanderer. In spite of his name, he spent the 80-odd years of a hard-working life without ever leaving New England. How the Mayflower came to Plymouth Harbor, and how they built their town, and of the cruel sickness that came upon them. December 1620. It was mid-December when the Mayflower weighed anchor and sailed across Cape Cod Bay. When she came within 6 miles of the mainland, the wind changed, and she had to beat out to sea again. Next day, the wind being fair, she came into Plymouth Harbor and anchored about 1.5 miles offshore. Because of the shallow water, she could get no nearer. The passengers had to ferry from ship to shore through the stormy waters all winter long. This bay is a most hopeful place, said Mr. Winslow, as they came ashore in the shallop to seek a situation or place to settle. As they explored inland, they studied the lay of the land, sampled the soil, carefully noted the positions of springs and brooks, and considered the possibilities of Indian attack from the surrounding forest. From the hilltop above the harbor, they could look to the seaward horizon and landward across the wooded hills to the sunset. It would be an excellent place for a fort, protecting the seaward slope. On this slope, they planned to build their houses. A brook of sweet water ran down beside it, and south of it were old Indian cornfields. They made their decision to settle in this place by vote, in the democratic English way. Here, by the abundant bay, at long last they would build. This would be their home and haven of rest after many storm-blown wanderings. Between the sinister forests and the bay, they would build a New England with their naked hands and a few tools, with sweat and tears and heartache. Before starting to build, they planned well. The congregation was separated into 19 families. Then, along a street that led from the hill to the water's edge, the hill slope was divided into plots. The families drew lots for their location. John Carver, who had been their leader aboard the Mayflower, was confirmed as governor for the coming year. This settlement was later known as the Plantation. 20 men remained ashore in a barricaded camp and began cutting timber for building. The rest lived on the Mayflower and went back and forth from the ship to their day's work ashore. On Christmas Day, they worked on the common house or shelter, which was for storing provisions, ammunition, and clothing. All that day the axes swung. At night the weary builders went back to the ship, leaving 20 men ashore. Between decks on the Mayflower they ate a meager dinner with British cheer. Then they sang the old carols, with their hearts back again in merry England, as a storm lashed through the rigging of the Mayflower in Plymouth Harbor. As the winter wore on, hacking coughs and fever and scurvy began to take their toll among the passengers. But whenever the rain and sleet died down, the men who could walk at all went ashore to work on the common house. They began the platform of the fort and the family dwellings along the new street. When the common house was thatched, provisions and ammunition were brought ashore and stored in it. In the remaining place, the sick beds lay end to end. Here, among the stricken, lay Bradford and Carver. One day a spark caught in the dry thatch of the common house, and its roof took fire. At the cries of alarm, the workmen rushed to the burning building and carried out the sick. Before the fire was checked, food and precious stores were damaged, but by the grace of God, no lives were lost. From the top of the mount, Miles Standish gazed grimly across the pine-clad hills in the west to where columns of smoke rose against the gray sky from Indian signal fires. For this thing called freedom, Standish now well knew there was a price to pay. Below him in the village, death had taken nearly half of the people. Rose Standish, his wife, was among the first who had died. He had knelt at her side at the last hour. He would rather have taken an arrow through his heart. 14 of the 18 Pilgrim wives had died. They had been buried at night in unmarked graves so that the Indians would not know how few remained. Sometimes there were 2 or 3 deaths in a day. He and a half-dozen others still had strength enough to feed the thin soup to the sick, to cheer the wasted forms in the crude beds, to hew wood and carry water so that Plymouth might live. Bradford, from his sickbed, had watched the stocky man of war, day and night on his rounds, tending the sick with a woman's tenderness. Years later, rugged old Governor Bradford remembered and wrote tribute in his blunt prose. Quote, "There was but 6 or 7 sound persons, so to their great commendations be it spoken, spared no pains night or day, but with abundance of toil and hazard of their own health, fetched them wood, made them fires, dressed them meat, made their beds, washed their loathsome clothes, clothed and unclothed them, in a word, did all ye homely and necessary offices for them, which dainty and queasy stomachs cannot endure to hear named. And all this willingly and cheerfully, without any grudging in ye least, showing herein their true love unto their friends and brethren. A rare example and worthy to be remembered. 2 of these were Mr. William Brewster, their reverend elder, and Miles Standish, their captain and military commander, unto whom myself and many others were much holden in our low and sick condition." Death had come aboard the Mayflower. One by one, the sickness took the riotous crew who brutally ignored their comrades, dying miserably in their bunks. To these men who had cursed and tormented them, the women aboard the ship brought what care and comfort they could with a Christ-like compassion. In the fires and ice of that first winter, their spirits were steel-tempered to build a nation of men and women who would never turn back in quest of freedom and justice and brotherhood. Lost in the Forest, January 1621. To those city dwellers from Leyden who, for years, had lived sheltered indoor lives, this rugged existence on the bleak New England hillside was utterly new and strange. Around and enclosing them stretched the mysterious forest. As they wandered into it in search of food or wood, unforeseen adventures suddenly beset them. Terrifying situations for which they were utterly unprepared overtook them. To men who had spent drab and colorless years at the looms of Leyden, each day in this strange world brought dangers, violent actions, and sudden challenges. One day at noon, 4 thatch cutters stopped work and got out their biscuits and cheese for dinner. After they had finished their simple meal, Peter Brown and John Goodman decided to walk in the woods toward the lakes with their 2 dogs. When Peter and John did not return, their companions searched the woods, calling and hallooing, but no trace of the men or dogs was to be found. Maybe Peter and John had walked into an Indian ambush. The 2 searchers hurried back to the plantation with the news. All that afternoon, a search party scoured the woods, but found no trace of the 2 men. Next day, a dozen musketeers ranged as far as they dared into the forest, but they had no success. The truth of the matter was that Peter and John had walked deep into the forest. Their 2 dogs, a little spaniel and a mastiff, had run ahead, sniffing among the leaves. Suddenly, the dogs made a dash through the thicket toward the lakeshore, and a great buck leaped lightly up and away. The chase was on. Peter and John ran excitedly after the dogs. This was a rare chance for venison for hungry Plymouth. The deer had vanished as if it had been on wings, but the dogs went rushing noisily through the brush. After an hour's chase, the 2 men became winded and called back their animals. As Peter and John tramped back among the bare tree trunks, they became bewildered and called until they were hoarse. They were lost. Even the dogs could not pick up their trail back. As the early winter twilight came on, it began to rain. The men were exhausted and very hungry. Soon the wind blew cold and snow began to fall. Utterly confused, they staggered on. Through the darkness, a long and dismal howl rose, and then another. It seemed to follow them. "It must be lions," said Peter, who knew very little about animals. The 2 men found a tree that they could easily climb. Very near them, another long howl wavered through the night. "It is a lion," said John, who knew even less about zoology. The spaniel whimpered, and the mastiff strained at her leash as the hair on their neck bristled, but the men held her back. When the lions came, Peter and John planned to let her go, while they themselves took to the tree. All that night they paced up and down in the snow and freezing cold, numb and unspeakably miserable. Dawn came and the howling ceased. They marched on through the snow. All morning they dragged on. That afternoon they crossed a 5-mile plain that had been burnt off by the Indians, and they came to a hill. From its top they caught a gleam of light on water. It was Plymouth Harbor. They could make out the island and the long fishhook peninsula. They staggered into the plantation, half frozen and exhausted, but still alive. A week later, John Goodman hobbled out for a walk on his lame feet with the little spaniel for a companion. 2 gray wolves leaped from a thicket and ran for the spaniel. The little dog dashed back to safety between John Goodman's legs. As the wolves circled, John heaved a log that struck one brute, and the wolves ran off. In a few minutes, they were back. John brandished a sharp stake he had found. The wolves drew off and sat on their haunches, grinning hungrily at the trembling spaniel. John himself was terribly shaky in the knees, but he stood his ground and dared the wolves to come on. After a while, they slunk off over the snow and disappeared in the woods. The plantation was a little island of safety in the threatening wilderness. Outside its palisade lay the vast unknown, the threatening forest, the wolves, the lurking Indians, the daily battle with cold and hunger and danger. But bright or dim, the light of faith and courage burned steadily and unfailingly through the short gray days and the long winter nights in the 7 houses clustered on the hillside by Plymouth Harbor. How the spring came, and how Samoset came out of the forest. March 1621. Spring comes slowly to New England, but the March sun rose higher in the south and filled the land with brightness. The sick rose from their beds, grew stronger daily, and set about their labors. 51 survivors were slowly coming back to life. Little birds broke into song among the new leaves. The skunk cabbage and the jack-in-the-pulpit sprang greenly by the brook, and the sound of spring thunder was heard. Women and children planted seeds in Plymouth gardens. On such a spring day, a hunter came with news. While he had been crouching in the bushes by the creekside to bag a brace of ducks, 12 Indians had passed by toward Plymouth. In the woods he had heard many more. Miles Standish and Francis Cook had left their tools in the forest. When they returned, their axes were gone. They could see Indian smoke signals, and silhouetted against the sky on a hilltop, 2 Indians signaled to them to come. When Standish and Cook crossed the brook and laid down their muskets in a sign of peace, the Indians disappeared. Captain Jones brought their 5 cannons ashore, 3 heavy pieces and 2 little bases. These were hauled lustily up the mountain, stationed on the unfinished gun platform. The people of Plymouth felt a lot safer as they looked toward the Indian smoke signals rising behind Watson Hill. On March 26, 1621, the Plymouth Assembly was in morning session at the Common House. Miles Standish had just been made officially their military commander. Suddenly, the door to the assembly room was pushed open, and a tall Indian boldly entered. Everyone jumped up. "Welcome, English," he said. "Me, Samoset." Then he added coolly, "Me want beer." For the first time, the amazed Englishmen were looking at an American Indian face to face. They gave him a glass of brandy, cheese, and crackers, and some roast duck. The room was now crowded with neighbors wanting to see the Indian. All afternoon, Samoset answered questions in English, such as it was. He said that the English had settled on the lands of the Patuxet Indians and that this tribe had been wiped out by the plague 4 years before. Samoset disclosed that the Indians who had attacked the exploring expedition at the first encounter were the Massasoits. 8 months before, this tribe had killed 3 Englishmen in a fight with Sir Fernando Gorges' party. The Massasoits hated the English because a shipmaster named Hunt had kidnapped a number of their people under pretext of bartering with them. Hunt had then sold them into slavery in Spain. Samoset himself had learned English from the fishermen who came each year to fish off the banks, and he knew their captains by name. He told the names, numbers, and chiefs of neighboring tribes. The elders were suspicious of Samoset as an overnight guest. However, he did not want to leave, so he was lodged at Stephen Hopkins' house, where he slept peacefully on the bare floor. Next morning, after giving Samoset a knife, a bracelet, and a ring, the elders bade him farewell. They rejoiced that at last they had made an intelligent and valuable friend, and that great good must come of it. Of the visit of that great chief, Massasoit, and of the lasting peace and friendship that was made between them. Next day, March 28th, was the Lord's Day in Plymouth. That afternoon, Samoset strode down the street with 5 tall Indians behind him. They wore deerskin cloaks and leggings of the same material. In their black hair were eagle feathers and foxtails, and their faces were painted black. They had left their bows and arrows outside the palisade. With them, they brought the tools that Miles Standish had left in the forest. The braves ate very heartily of what the elders provided, and in return danced and sang for the amazed pilgrims. The Indians had come to barter, but Mr. Brewster explained that it was not the pilgrims' custom on the Lord's Day. If the Indians would come again with many beaver skins, the Plymouth folk would be glad to trade. So they gave the Indians bright trinkets and sent them back to the forest with an armed escort. March 31st was a special day in the plantation because the storm-damaged shallop was repaired and Captain Jones brought to land the last boatload of passengers from the Mayflower. It had been just 3 months since the first pilgrims had landed. A few days later, Samoset again appeared at the door of the meeting house. He brought with him his friend, Tisquantum, or Squanto. He was the last of the Patuxets and spoke English. He had been taken captive by Hunt and sold in Spain. Later, Squanto had lived in England and had finally come home to the tragic scene where the last of his people had perished. After introducing Squanto, Samoset announced that the great chief Massasoit and his brother, Quadakina, with 60 warriors, were waiting on a nearby hilltop to counsel with the English. Edward Winslow was sent with presents of food and brandy to greet them. He told the chief that King James saluted Massasoit as his friend and ally, and that Governor Carver wished to make peace and to barter with the great chief, his neighbor. Winslow invited him to come to their plantation. Captain Standish and a guard of musketeers met Chief Massasoit and his 20 braves at the town brook and escorted him to an unfinished house. Here Massasoit was seated in state on a green rug and colored cushions. Governor Carver now came to meet him, followed by a drummer and a trumpeter playing bravely. The rest of the Plymouth musketeers completed the parade. The chief was a superb figure of a man. His grave countenance was painted vermilion, and his scalp lock decorated with feathers. The bodies of his warriors were painted with ceremonial decorations in black, red, white, and yellow. Carver solemnly bent to kiss the Indian chief's hand. When they all sat down, Massasoit was presented with a mug of brandy. As the fiery liquid went down the chief's throat, he shuddered and later broke into a sweat. Point by point, Samoset translated for Massasoit the 7 articles of the peace treaty and mutual alliance. The words danced dizzily through the fumes of the Dutch brandy in the chief's befuddled brain. In effect, the treaty stated that 1. There should be no aggression against each other. 2. Indians who damaged the English were to be turned over for punishment. 3. Stolen goods were to be returned. This was to apply to both Indians and English. 4. Each party would help the other in case either was attacked. 5. Massasoit should notify neighboring tribes of the defense pact and invite them to join. 6. Each party, when visiting the other, would leave his weapons behind. 7. Under these conditions, King James would esteem Massasoit his friend and ally. After Massasoit had somewhat shakily put his mark to the treaty, there was good-humored visiting. The chief was much impressed with the governor's trumpet, and his warriors tried in vain to make it speak. On the chief's departure, Governor Carver in person escorted him to the brook. During the meeting, Winslow had remained with the Indians on the hill as a hostage. In like manner, the English had kept 6 braves. Codikina, the chief's brother, now came down to Plymouth to be entertained. That night, the English kept close watch just to see if the peace would really stick. But as the days passed, and their woodsmen and hunters came back unharmed from the forest, they were certain that the chief would keep faith. This treaty stood unbroken for 50 years. A few days later, Squanto created a sensation by bringing to Plymouth a mess of fat eels, which he had procured by treading them out of the mud with his feet. This trick he willingly taught the younger members of the colony, who soon became his friends and admirers. Squanto led them to the best fishing grounds and clam beds, showed them how to plant a fat herring in each cornhill to make the stalks grow tall and bear full golden ears, how to make snares and traps, where the deer herds browsed, and where the fat turkeys fed among the berry bushes.